This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And I want to give a special thank you to John Jers, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Alright, so now let's get to our panel.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 375 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be reviewing the movies I Kill Giants, A Monster Calls, and Colossal, which each present a personal, metaphorical take on the idea of giant monsters. And this will involve spoilers for all of those movies, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So, first up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, making her 13th appearance on the show. She's a Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in New York City with a Renaissance engineer, a dog, and a bird. So, Sara, welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure.
Then next up, we've got Seth Dickinson, making his 7th appearance on the show. He's the author of the novels The Traitor Brew Cormorant and The Monster Brew Cormorant, and his short fiction appears in magazines such as Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Clark's World, and Tor.com. So, Seth, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
And also joining us today is Lisa Yaszek, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 346. She's a professor of science fiction studies at Georgia Tech, and author of the nonfiction books Galactic Suburbia, Sisters of Tomorrow, and The Future is Female. She also recently appeared in the AMC miniseries James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. So, Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, and so as I mentioned today on the show, we'll be talking about these more personal, metaphorical giant monster movies. But first, I'm just curious about what everyone thinks of more traditional giant monster movies such as Godzilla, Cloverfield, and Pacific Rim. So, Lisa, let's start off with you. Are you a fan of those sorts of movies?
I am. I love big giant monsters. In fact, I've been in my global science fiction class, I've been using it as an excuse to teach mecha stories. So it's been really fun to look at big giant monsters and big giant robots fighting each other. So yeah, I'm a huge fan. Even when it totally breaks reality, I'm good.
So what are some examples of some movies that you show in your class?
So we do a lot with Japanese anime, and we've been doing, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the names of the different ones we've been doing, and of course I'm going to lose them. Pat Labor, we've done Evangelion, of course everyone loves that one. And then we just did The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, which actually doesn't involve any monsters, just time travel, but that one was really fun too.
And when you say mecha, could you just explain what you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, mecha, gigantic fighting robots. So for people who've seen Pacific Rim, I think that's the big Hollywood example that we have right now.
What did you think of Pacific Rim?
I liked it. I'm a fan of the big giant fighting robots, like I said. And it was interesting to me. A lot of people I know didn't like it. I think they were looking for stories about traditional American rugged individual heroes rather than teams of people working together through and with machines. But I find that inspiring and just fun to watch all the destruction.
How about Seth? What did you think of these Godzilla, Cloverfield type movies?
So I'm actually a big unfan of Pacific Rim. I don't like it very much, but I do like the genre. I really liked Shin Godzilla, which I think just means New Godzilla. It was the Japanese recent Godzilla reboot directed by Hideaki Anno, who I think did Evangelion.
Yep.
And it was it was not an American movie. There's this guy, he's like a maverick scientist. He predicts disaster when everyone else thinks it's going to be fine. And being an American, I kind of expected him to go off on his own and save the day. But the way this movie approaches it is they give him his own office and his own team. And it's very much a movie about like disaster response and how communities and bureaucracies especially face disaster. It's also gorgeous. Like you just don't see shot composition like that in Hollywood cinematography, even from like Guillermo del Toro, who's an amazing director. I really recommend Shin Godzilla.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I found Pacific Rim, I found the characters sort of bland and forgettable. I thought I watched the recent Godzilla one, not the most recent one, but the one before that, which I thought was I got my money's worth, but I didn't really stick in my mind. And then Cloverfield, I actually really liked, but I felt like it was sort of a very enjoyable amusement park ride. And again, the characters didn't really stick with me that much. Seth, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of feelings about Cloverfield. About Pacific Rim and Cloverfield. Kind of I think you have to look at Cloverfield in the context of found footage movies too, and it is a spectacular example of those. I like Cloverfield. The recent sequel, I don't know what they were thinking turning it into a franchise with thinly connected movies. I think the way the name has been used is they put it on unrelated horror movies to give them a marketing boost, and one of those is really good, the 10 Cloverfield Lane with Mary Elizabeth Winstead, but the recent Cloverfield Paradox was terrible.
Yeah,
huge disappointments.
That's what I heard. I didn't see it. How about Sarah? What do you think of these kinds of movies?
I usually enjoy them for, sort of what they are. Like they end up being popcorn flicks, and I think how you describe them, Dave, is pretty on point. Just in terms of, they tend to be movies you watch once and you enjoy them and you appreciate that you were entertained, but they're very rarely much more beyond that.
Right. Yeah. I think, like I said, my problem with a lot of these movies, and I do, for the most part, enjoy the giant monster action, but there seems to be sort of a disconnect between, it's hard to make the audience, or at least hard to make me care about the human characters when they're set against such giant monsters. And there's a compendium of wit and wisdom for science fiction writers called the Turkey City Lexicon. And it has an entry called Squid on the Mantelpiece. And I'll just read what it says, because I think this is really good. It says, Chekhov said that if there are dueling pistols over the mantelpiece in the first act, they should be fired in the third. In other words, a plot element should be deployed in a timely fashion and with proper dramatic emphasis. However, in SF plotting, the MacGuffins are often so overwhelming that they cause conventional plot structures to collapse. It's hard to properly dramatize, say, the domestic effects of Dad's bank overdraft when a giant writhing kraken is leveling the city. This mismatch between the conventional dramatic proprieties and SF's extreme, grotesque, or visionary thematics is known as the squid on the mantelpiece. And yeah, I think that's an issue for me with a lot of these movies, is that often there's this sort of the B character plot where there's a parent and child and they are squabbling, and then in the course of the gigantic monster disaster, then they, realize that they actually love each other at the end. And you're supposed to leave the movie feeling good, but I'm kind of like, yeah, but like 1 million people died in the course of this movie. Like, who cares about this family, right?
Right. Well, wasn't it? It's Pamela Sargent. She's a science fiction writer and anthologist, and she once said science fiction's a literature of ideas and not a literature of character, right? And it seems like that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? Is that especially the big budget Hollywood movies, they really, maybe they're not about ideas, but they're certainly the spectacle of destruction, right? Maybe Susan Sontag is who I should be invoking here. But yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't care that they're not about people, but maybe I don't care about Hollywood people. I'm sort of in it. And also I see these movies at the drive-in. So, I think that puts you maybe in a different head, because you don't need deep character development when you're sitting outside with a beer and watching a film.
well, yeah. For me, there's a whole class of movies which I think should really just be 90-minute long special effects reels. That the characterization is just detracts from what I really want to see, which is the giant monsters smashing buildings and stuff like that.
Right.
And I feel like so many of these movies are dragged down by poorly done characters. It would be great to have well done characters, but I would rather have no characters than poorly done characters.
I think a lot of these movies, the characters are the monsters. Like, when you think about Cloverfield versus Godzilla, those are very different people. Like, they're giant monsters destroying the city. But from the way they're rendered, the way they move, the things they do, you get a really different idea of what they're about. And like, Godzilla's an icon. King Kong's an icon. Not just because of what they do, but because of how we think about what they want. Like, we think of Godzilla as kind of punishing mankind's sins, but also protecting us. And King Kong, is kind of a child, almost a victim. We brought him from his habitat, and he's pretty mad about it, but ultimately he's at our mercy, not the other way around. To me, that's the character heart of giant monster movies, the monster itself.
Yeah, I think it's most successful when they do that. I mean, the simplicity of King Kong, for instance, is still such a pleasure to watch, despite being black and white, and despite obviously there being so many more movies that came after that tried to do the same thing. The original is so much more successful than a lot of what tried to repeat it, in part because its charm is in its simplicity and in the fact that you sort of are rooting for King Kong just as much as you are sort of hoping that everybody doesn't get killed. So.
Right. And I want to say, I mean, when I was, proposing or sort of batting around the idea for this panel on Facebook, and one of my friends said, I said, I want to talk about metaphorical monster movies as opposed to literal monster movies like Godzilla. And he says, well, no, but Godzilla is a metaphor for like the atomic bomb, right? Which is obviously true, right? I mean, it's sort of, a common observation that in American popular culture post World War II, atomic power creates superheroes, and in Japanese culture, it creates monsters that destroy cities, right? And there's really obvious reasons for that. But I feel like, what I want to talk about on this panel, so there are obviously like many or most maybe giant monster movies, the monster is a metaphor for something, but that within the reality of the story, that in Godzilla, it's treated as a realistic monster in the sense that, you need an army to fight it. You can't defeat it by, coming to grips with something inside yourself or something like that, right? And
well,
I thought
very
it was
literal, right? It's really literal. It literally instantiates all the dangers of nuclear war, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But I thought it was interesting that there was these three movies that I came across that I know of, where they take this trope. It's sort of like the next, to my mind, that's kind of the next. We all kind of know the giant monster trope, and now it's like, okay, well, what else can you do? What new spin can you put on it? And so these three movies that that we all watched, I Kill Giants, Monster Calls, and Colossal, they sort of take that idea, but they make it very personal, and there's some sort of personal connection between the protagonist and the giant monster. And I feel like maybe that in some way that presents a solution to this problem that the Turkey City Lexicon was outlining of, like, does the monster just overwhelm the whole story? And maybe that doesn't happen if it's so overtly metaphorical and so overtly personal. Seth, what do you think about that?
I think all three of these movies are really careful not to let the monster overwhelm that angle. Like in two of them, in Monster Calls and I Kill Giants, nobody except the core protagonist is allowed to believe the monster's real. Which I think both of them leave a little ambiguity about whether you're supposed to take away the external existence of this monster, but they're both really easily read as like purely psychological, realistic stories. Colossal isn't quite so restrained, but even so, like Colossal has this twist where the two battling monsters are embodied by the characters. They don't exist without the two protagonists in conflict, Anne Hathaway and her...
Jason Sudeikis? Is that his name?
Yes, Jason Sudeikis. They're really, all of them are very careful. All three of these movies are very meticulous about positioning the monsters as, whether they physically exist or not, avatars of a conflict between the characters, or something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to say, in defense of like other monster movies, that a lot of their best moments too come from twinning what's going on with the monster and what's going on with the protagonist. I think even the Godzilla you saw, the Gareth Edwards Godzilla from a couple of years ago, nobody would say that movie is a great protagonist. He's really boring. But probably his best scenes are when he and Godzilla are both fighting in the same city, and they're both kind of at their end, and you can feel this connection between them where their fates are intertwined, even though it's not like our hero is physically piloting Godzilla like an Evangelion or something. But there's still that link there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so Sarah, what did you think just overall of these three movies when I, had you watch them? Did you feel like this is kind of an interesting break from the past of giant monster movies, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it, in some ways it's sort of the marriage of what's good about monster movies, instead of, sort of trying to make it like, that this bad character that's actually misunderstood and is a gentle giant or something like that, just taking that whole structure away and still having the drama and the tension underneath, but making it much more, obviously of a metaphor of real things that people are going through, cancer and death and so on. So I think that they were all very touching.
Mm-hmm. Had you heard of any of these movies, Sarah, before I emailed you about it?
I'd heard of A Monster Calls, and I remember stuff going by on it on Twitter, and it was kind of on the proverbial list. And because there's so many shows and movies these days, that it got bumped perpetually until I pretty much forgot about it. And then, of course, you stop seeing it around in the culture, and you stop seeing it on Twitter, and so it sort of drops off indefinitely. And of course, you're here to bring them back. So I was delighted actually with that's right, with all of them. They were all very touching in very different ways. So
how about Lisa? How much familiarity did you have with these movies going into this panel?
Yeah, I'd heard of all three of them, and I'd seen Colossal already, which I'd enjoyed. I hadn't seen the other two. I'm more of a science fiction person than a fantasy person, and but then it was good to loop back to them, and yeah, I was impressed with how deftly they handled the subject, and I think it's really interesting. I had went back and I was looking really quickly at the history of monster movies, and all the early ones really are these expressions of fears about very literal things and ways we're changing the earth, like, right, monsters produced by atomic energy, and then in the 70s, monsters produced by ecological disaster. And then you have this swing in the 80s and 90s to the whole friendly giant thing, like with the Iron Giant and, oh gosh, the movie that Andre the Giant is in. Is that Princess Bride, I think?
Yeah, Princess,
right?
Princess Bride, yeah.
And so, it's no surprise to me that after you've gone from one extreme to the other, you have to go to the weird and the psychological and the internal. And I thought that all three of them did a really nice job with that, with using this imagery to just, right, giants are usually about disasters in physical landscapes. These were really great explorations of traumatic changes in emotional and domestic landscapes, I thought.
Right. And since you mentioned Iron Giant, I mean, I love that movie. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I feel like that movie is about as good a movie as you can do about, like, a kid who becomes friends with a giant robot, and not making it metaphorical really, or psychological, but just treating that literally. Yeah. And that particularly A Monster Calls is almost like the Iron Giant made, rendered psychological.
Yeah, yeah.
While we're talking about psychology of giant monsters, I just wanted to throw in that Cloverfield, almost belongs to this category too, in that it's so much about 9/11 and the post 9/11 trauma. Like, the characters aren't the purpose of the monster in that movie is just to put the characters into this single nightmare situation in New York where they're trying to get in touch with their loved ones and trying to survive, but they don't understand anything that's going on. And there's even a little of the post 9/11 reaction in there with the military coming in and bombing the city. And sorry if you guys, I guess we didn't warn for spoilers on Cloverfield. Consider yourself warned now. The military ultimately bombing them and killing them. That whole movie's really very, like, Bush era. So to me, the sick mother of Cloverfield is the 9/11 situation.
Well, right. So let's get into these movies in case anyone hasn't seen them. So let's start. I was going to start off with I Kill Giants. So I Kill Giants. It's about this girl. I think she's 10 or so, and she is an outsider, and she dresses in sort of unusual clothes and has sort of like stuffed animal bunny ears that she wears, and is really into Dungeons and Dragons, and sort of talks and is not, tells people that she's defending the city from these what she calls giants, using all sorts of traps and magical spells. And she has this magical warhammer that she believes she keeps in this pouch around her neck. And as Seth was saying, nobody else believes her. Nobody else apparently can see any of these, supernatural manifestations that she can see. And so I read an interview with the director who said that test audiences had a lot of difficulty with this main character, that they found her unsympathetic. I actually really liked her a lot. She's very snarky and misunderstood. But I thought we would start there. So, Sarah, what did you think of the protagonist in I Kill Giants? Did you find her relatable or sympathetic?
Yeah, in fact, I thought that she's one of the most relatable characters like that I've ever seen in these kinds of movies, because, you often see sort of this sort of nerdy, geeky girl, and it's played by some gorgeous actress. And they've given her like a pair of glasses, and they sort of, I guess they sort of, told her to drop her shoulders a little bit and look a little bit. But it's like, come on, that's not how society would respond. In high school in particular, that kind of environment would actually respond to an Emma Watson, for instance. And so, for me, the idea of having this character who's sort of could be on the spectrum, could be schizophrenic, could be all kinds of bizarre things that are going through your head while you're watching this, character interact, where she genuinely has issues. And you don't really see that. You see us pretending, the audience pretending like the character is unlikable, right? But it's very brave to actually genuinely make her a little bit unlikable, because then you're like, oh, well, I can kind of see where people are coming from here. So I thought that was a really, bold choice. And I think it's a good thing that, that people are saying that she was a little bit unlikable.
I mean, one thing that I didn't honestly notice this watching the movie, but a review pointed it out, but basically every character in this movie is female. She has a brother who has a few lines, and I think there's a male principal who has a few lines. But aside from that, every character, every, significant character in the movie is female. Is that something, did you notice that, Sarah, while you were watching it?
Absolutely. And I loved it. I thought it was great. Sort of the main thing that happens with a man is, that the brother is sort of playing video games and is being super dismissive and violent. And, then there's this world of women and making choices and how they interact with each other. And it was really charming.
What did you think of, so the main character, Barbara, is being bullied by this bully in her class or in her school, Taylor. What did you think of that character?
I thought she was very realistic, in terms of how bullies behave and especially how female bullies behave, which is a little bit different and meaner and less physical. I mean, they certainly get into some physical altercations, but for the most part, there's sort of this sense of, well, I know your mom's sick and I don't care. And, that sense of cattiness that happens, sometimes in those kinds of environments. So I thought it was very successful.
Mm. How about Lisa? What did you think of the bullying?
Yeah, everything Sarah said, I agree. It made a lot of sense. And especially, right, the way that she goes after the best friend, or the new friend at least, and tries to split up what little bit of community that our lead character has created for herself with her friend. That felt right. Yeah, absolutely on target. And then when the tables were turned at the end, and again, I know we're doing spoilers here, that was actually the one moment that felt slightly less plausible. Of course, it was wonderful to see the bully get taken down. I just don't know, though, if I felt like the school would have really reacted that way, given how thoroughly it's been made clear that our heroine, Barbara, is kind of unlikable and strange. I'm not sure that when she tricks Taylor, everyone would think that was hilarious.
Why don't you, just for people who haven't seen the movie, could you say what do you mean by the tables are turned?
Right. So, Taylor is bullying our heroine, Barbara. And at the end, towards the end, Barbara has a moment when she can get the upper hand and make a fool out of Taylor in front of everyone. And it feels really narratively satisfying. And it certainly makes sense in terms of Barbara, but I just felt like the school's reaction to it, was a little pat. I'm not sure why. It broke some of the very carefully built reality for me. But otherwise, yeah.
I guess we
liked that.
Oh, yeah. Seth.
I thought one of the reasons that worked for me is that the actress playing the bully brought a lot to it. There were probably a lot of different ways to play that role in the script. Not many of them even two-dimensional, like most of them very flat.
Right.
But she did add this little sense of, like, I got the sense she herself, the bully, was in a pretty shitty place in the school, was maybe not quite the queen bee, mean girl, and was maybe just a couple rungs above our hapless protagonist in the power structure. So I did believe that other people would turn on her the way that she was. I got the sense that she felt her own power was really tenuous and precarious, and that's part of why she was so vicious.
Okay.
But I don't know if I'm just reading too much into the actress's choices.
Yeah, well, let me just set up a little bit more about what's going on in the story, because we've jumped ahead a little bit. So Barbara, this sort of misfit character, lives with her brother and her older sister, and the older sister seems to be taking care of the younger siblings. And we have the impression that the parents are dead. That was the impression I think that we're meant to have, or are out of the picture for somehow. And then Barbara is also confronted by these things she calls harbingers, which are these sort of like, I don't know, like out of focus Grim Reaper kind of monsters that tell her that she's not good enough and she's never going to be able to defeat the giants and things like that. And as the story progresses, and we see that there's something upstairs that she's afraid of, or there's some sort of haunting going on upstairs, and she sees these dark tentacles kind of reaching down the stairs for her and calling her name. And so, again, spoiler warning, at the end of the movie, it turns out that that her mother is not dead, but is terminally ill. And the giants are sort of a manifestation of her fears around her mother's mortality. So Seth, what did you think of that? Did you see that coming, and what did you think of it when it happened?
Yeah, I saw it coming. I was really, really braced for it to be bad. But I think the movie sold it pretty well. Both as a twist in that you get a lot of hints that there's something upstairs that Barbara, did I get that right? Barbara, yeah. is really afraid of. But also Jennifer L., who I think, L or Air, who plays the mother, is just one of my favorite character actresses. And her 20 seconds of screen time absolutely destroyed me. She was so good.
Yeah.
Did you watch this, Seth, before or after A Monster Calls?
I watched it right before A Monster Calls.
Okay. Because I feel like the ending to this might be easier to predict coming off of A Monster Calls.
And vice versa, yeah.
But yeah, so how about so Sarah, what'd you think of that twist at the end of I Kill Giants?
I thought that it sort of, I had a hard time with, understanding why nobody talks to the kid, because I feel like, you always sort of in movies like this where you're like, why is nobody just talking about the elephant in the room? Like, this is a kid. And if you know that a kid is acting out and being angry and being a little weird, and you know that her mother is terminally ill, that probably has something to do with it. And so nobody kind of sat her down. And then I thought, well, maybe they had those conversations in the beginning, and people, I forget that people are not wholly emotionally intelligent. It's sort of one of those things where you go around in life, and I was homeschooled, and I've always been very introverted, and so I look at scenarios and I'm like, why are people so unemotionally intelligent? And then I look at the world and I'm like, oh, okay. they really are. It is really more rare than I remember. So it might have been that they had those discussions at the beginning when the mother fell ill, but then as people kind of go into the routine, and sometimes cancer drags on forever, people forget, like, hey, this kid is still going through this. So I'm willing to sort of forgive them for that. But it's kind of one of those things that made it possible, that made the story possible, is the fact that none of the adults seem to say to her, hey, I know your mom is dying, and this might be related, how you're behaving and stuff like that might be related to that. You would think that somebody would bring it up at some point. But, it wasn't implausible overall, I think.
I think people do try to bring it up, but she rejects it so violently. Like, her entire second life with these giants is so tied up with her mother's illness that when her friend Sophia tries to, like, even say the words "your mother," it's like deadened out on the dialogue track, as if Barbara physically cannot hear the words. And I don't know if it's that she's maybe autistic and gets overstimulated really easily, but she clearly, when people push her emotional space, she withdraws into really vivid, imagined and often really negative imagery. So I expect by the point the movie picks up, everybody who already knows about her mom has learned that Barbara will go catatonic if you try to bring the topic up with her. And
I buy that.
Yeah.
I have to say, I had the same trouble Sarah had, and I see, Seth, what you're saying, and I kind of buy it, but I got to tell you, as the mother of a 10-year-old boy in public school, it's really hard for me to suspend my disbelief because I know what the infrastructure is there, and I just don't believe that a kid would fall through the cracks quite like that. But having said that, this movie is very much from Barbara's perspective, and if she doesn't hear people approaching her, then maybe it just doesn't register on her landscape, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I read there's an interesting article online, and the headline is something like, a movie critic who hated a movie meets the director whose movie he hated. It was something like that. And it's this movie. And overall, I really enjoyed this movie for the most part. But I thought that the part I had the most trouble with was that after Barbara sort of comes to terms with everything at the end, there's this coda where she's dressing in normal clothes and seems happy and well adjusted. And it just seems very sort of like abrupt and, not in keeping with the rest of the movie. And, I had liked who she was, and now it seems like she's kind of turned into a different person. And this reviewer was sort of saying that, he watched this movie while I think it was his father was dying of cancer, or maybe had recently died of cancer, and that he sort of resented how the struggle that he had never really come to terms with, or was still struggling to come to terms with, that the protagonist in the movie went through that process of healing in like 2 minutes of screen time. And I thought that was a pretty legitimate criticism of this movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things I found the protagonist really, unsympathetic, like a lot of people did, as I started watching. And I think part of that was because I recognized in her, she's not just one of the kids from Stranger Things where they're clearly really likable. Nobody likes them, but they like each other. They stick together. They play D&D, and they're very positive. She does a lot of things to keep other people away, and some things that are clearly negative that you want to, you wish she would stop. And I think part of the reason I found her unsympathetic at first and really grew to like her was that, I did some of those same things myself as a child, and recognizing them is hard. Like seeing the ways that people learn behaviors that make things worse for them, or at least don't help. So I think the criticism that, she wouldn't have unlearned all this in 2 minutes is a pretty accurate one. It's sad to say, but I feel like she would have walked away from this with a lot more lasting damage. Hopefully, on an upward trajectory. But
so Lisa, you mentioned that you have a child who's basically this age, and one of my reactions to this movie too was that I felt like it felt like it was set. I don't know. I felt like it was supposed to be set in the present, but to me, it felt more like the 70s or the 80s or something in terms of how like you said, how the school, the dynamics at the school, and how this girl is just allowed to roam all over the neighborhood and hang out in the abandoned train yard, and nobody seems to care where the police aren't looking for her, right. Truancy and all that kind of stuff. Did you have that same sort of reaction?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's in no ways matches the kind of middle class lifestyle that my 10-year-old is experiencing. Having said that, there are kids who are going home after school and still running around. So I do recognize that's kind of diverse. I guess I didn't worry about it too much, or I tried to put it aside just because, right, this is a movie that operates in a sort of fantastic and almost mythic mode so often. But yeah, it certainly didn't feel like, oh, I recognize this as anything like the life my son leads or anything. But once I said, okay, this is just operating in this American fantastic, it becomes a little easier to deal with some of that. And I even felt that way about the emotional change at the end. I mean, there's no way in which that felt plausible, right? I agree with Seth and Sarah. You don't walk out of that situation without some change to you, and some time. It takes time to get over that. But I think once I sort of accept that maybe there are giants in this world, I could accept some other things.
Well, actually, on that point, I mean, Seth was saying that the movie leaves it ambiguous whether the giants are real or not. I thought the only thing that makes me think that giants are definitely real is the fact that there was this freak storm that happens to coincide with her emotional climax / epiphany. It's just very hard for me to buy that as a random coincidence in a world in which nothing supernatural is happening.
There might be one footprint. You can read that as Sophia buying into the fantasy, but I thought I saw a footprint that she kind of paused and stared at.
I saw that too. And actually, every time Barbara encounters the giants, there's a natural disturbance beforehand. Like the birds start flocking differently or moving and the trees move differently. So, if you want to read that as a sign that the giants are making some mark on the universe. But again, right, it could also just be how Barbara sees the world. Tough to say. I don't know. I sort of saw it, though. I'm with you. I feel like at the end, maybe they could be real. And maybe they just are attracted to emotional distress, right?
Sarah, what do you think?
I think that, all of these movies, with the exception probably of Colossal, try to sort of make it, teetering on the edge of ambiguousness for, on purpose. And that's probably the best place for it to be given the style. But I also think that, in regards to the vintage feel, I think a lot of these filmmakers are recreating what childhood felt like to them. And as a child of the 80s, I appreciate that, and some of them are doing it very literally, like in Stranger Things, where it's just nostalgia porn, and I am here for it, like all of it. But, in many ways, it's much more subtle. But I think it's actually sort of part of the charm for me, because it feels like what childhood felt like in the 80s, and so it's to me, it's a successful decision.
Mm. All right, let's talk about A Monster Calls. So these are actually like weirdly similar stories. I think they were, examples of convergent evolution or something. I think the creators came up with them separately. But so in A Monster Calls, again, we have a protagonist who I think is about 10 years old, and his mother is, again, terminally ill with cancer. This movie doesn't make that the twist. You know that right off, right from the beginning. And so it's more, overtly about how is he grappling with that. And so in this one, he's a very imaginative boy, and he sort of imagines that there's this yew tree that he can see from his bedroom window, and he imagines that it's really happening, who knows, that it turns into a giant tree man who comes to his window and says, I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and then you're going to tell me a story. And that's kind of the structure of the movie. So how about Seth? What did you think of that basic story structure? Yeah,
it's funny that the two movies kind of have this deep impact Armageddon relationship. I find it a little simple, but also I think these are movies for kids. So I can't hold that against them. One thing I really liked about A Monster Calls compared to I Killed Giants is that the giant has a lot more personality and a lot more screen time, and is voiced by Liam Neeson really, really well. Yeah. He's not directly sympathetic. He's got kind of this tough love approach, which I found really effective. I haven't actually, so he tells these 3 stories to the kid as I think ways to help him through different stages of grief, but I haven't parsed those stories for a lot of deep, like, symbolic meaning, except for the part where he destroys everything and therefore teaches our child protagonist how great it is to smash stuff when you're angry. I don't know. Did you guys detect any, I think the first story is about a prince, a farm girl, and a witch. The second story is about medicine and a healer and a priest who will give up anything to have his daughters saved. And I don't remember the third one off the top of my head. Did you guys connect all of those?
Somebody was invisible and wanted to be seen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you, Seth. I thought all the stories were supposed to be maybe not lessons. I don't know if they were lessons or parables, but yeah, they definitely mapped to what was happening, I thought, in his life. Because that first one, right, is about the prince, the witch, and the princess. And that's right when he is sort of shifting over to living with his grandmother or having to engage her more, right? And then the second story, I'm trying to remember now, but I remember at the time thinking, yeah, this all maps. Wasn't this the point of the second story? Basically, you can never tell who's the good guy and who's the bad guy.
Yes, and also that healing is a matter of belief.
And that's something he has to figure out with both his mom and his dad, right? Or his grandma and his dad. Because at first, dad seems like a great guy. And it turns out dad's kind of flawed, right? That he's sympathetic to his son, but not willing to really become more physically or emotionally involved in his life. Dad is there, I guess, divorced and living with a different family by this point in California. But then dad also gives him good advice. So he becomes a very complicated character. And I thought the point of that story was people are complicated.
Sarah, what did you think of this? What did you think of the stories within a story?
Well, it's one of those movies that, it's just sad. And I appreciate that. It's something that's, I think actually I probably saw the trailer and it's one of those trailers where you feel like you watched the whole movie. And I remember now that I've watched it, like, oh, okay, yeah, I remember watching the trailer and thinking, well, that looks sad. And it was. But it was also really successfully, it was a very simple story. There wasn't even that much, overall dialogue. A lot was told with shots. There was just there would be a shot just of the inside of a pencil sharpener that was really beautiful. And all of that aided the feel of the character so much. And I really feel like, part of what made it successful is that each of the characters was very real, and very complex. And you have the grandmother who in the beginning you feel like she's, rather stoic. And, she doesn't seem like a really great grandmother in terms of, hey, you have to be warm with children, especially children whose mothers are dying. But then, when the kid smashes up all of her priceless heirlooms, she understands that, punishing the kid is not going to help anyone. And she's just going to, sort of grieve privately. And then the kid understands in turn, oh, what have I done? And I get it. She's losing her child too, just as I'm losing my mother. And so it's kind of interesting that all of that is ultimately told without telling it directly. And I think that even though it's a very simple story, that it's simple in the most successful sense. And if I was, if my nephew or something was losing someone to cancer or some other thing, and any child was losing a parent, that would be one of the first movies that I would want them to watch.
Right. I agree with you that both these movies are very sad. I mean, I totally cried at the ending of both these movies. Yeah. I mean, I feel like, Seth was saying that these are kids' movies. I'm not sure if I agree with that. And I'm not actually sure who they're for necessarily, because even though I think they're both really good, because I feel like they're not for kids in the sense that I don't think most kids can really relate to that sort of grief, or, I could be wrong, but then I also feel like most adults don't necessarily want to watch a cancer movie about a talking tree, so it's sort of like, I kind of felt like this was sort of a movie that, a filmmaker would make it because he thinks that it's an important story to tell. But I'm not sure that it would really connect with that large of an audience. And I think that might be, I guess I'll just note that all of these movies were pretty much total box office bombs. Although they were all, I think they're all quite good and were all pretty well reviewed. So let's come to that question, Lisa. Who do you think is the audience, if anyone, for Monster Calls?
I have no darn idea, and I wanted to ask all of you that same question because I can tell you I'm fairly sure it's not my 10-year-old. I can say that. And it wasn't me either. I have to admit, I had known about both of these movies and I had purposely avoided them, in large part because as a mother of a 10-year-old kid, I kind of just don't need to watch movies about moms dying. And then also as a feminist, I got to say, we tell a lot of stories about dead women in our culture. And there was an Edgar Allan Poe who once said the most poetic topic is a dead woman's body. And I just can't do it all the time. Yeah. So I have a hard time. Having said that, I do think both of these movies were really beautiful. And I'm actually glad I saw them. I cried buckets. They were insane. Yes. I would never show it to my son, I don't think. And I'm not sure who they go to. I think one thing that was cool, right, is that in a world where we have a lot of really big problems that are very obvious that we all talk about, like global warming or the shifting governments and there are shifting priorities across the globe, that sometimes we forget about issues of personal loss. And I do think these movies remind us how important the personal is and our interiors and our psyches, and how much we need to care for ourselves and each other as much as we need to care about those big issues. But I still don't know who needs to see this movie. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, it's kind of like the sad dog movie, which is like a whole genre. And as a dog person, I avoid those movies like the plague. And I'm like, is there some Venn diagram somewhere of people who are dog people and people who actually just want to cry about dogs all the time? Like, I don't want to do it. Like,
right.
I'm still crying every other month over my dog that died 2 years ago. I don't need any help in that department. So,
but there's a tradition of movies, right? They used to call them weepies. So clearly there's some group of people who really enjoy the emotional catharsis of these movies, but maybe not with metaphorical and literal giants. I
feel like it might be, like the traditional weepies were probably not that expensive to make, but right. These movies have like $15 million budgets, and there might not be enough people who want to go see a movie and cry to sustain, a $15 million movie like this.
Right.
Although I will say, every time I accidentally use the wrong contact solution, I'm really grateful that I have the first 20 minutes of Up, because I do not want to wash my eyes with saline. I find it hurts. But if I watch the first 20 minutes of Up after putting the wrong thing in my eye, I'm good.
I mean, Seth, what do you think about this question of who are these movies for?
I really like sad movies. And, if you look at movies that are definitely for kids, like, even like The Lion King, a lot of them deal with tremendously powerful grief in a symbolic way, not in a cinematic, realistic way like these movies do. But I think these are probably for older kids or younger teenagers. That's who I would think they were for. But maybe I am too cruel to children.
I'm thinking like you're talking about like Bambi and stuff, right?
Yeah,
I feel
the
like
Land Before Time,
or The Lion King. But I feel like the parents die like 1/3 to halfway through those movies, and then that's not really the focus of the rest of the movie. Whereas that's pretty much the sole focus of these movies, or like the primary focus of these movies.
Well, parents dying in Disney films is pretty much 90% of Disney films.
Yeah.
But I think in part that's because when you are a child, your biggest fear is something happening to your parents. Like, that is every child's worst fear, unless your parents are nightmares. So,
I just feel like if I were, when I were a kid, if I hadn't experienced any grief, like, I would watch these movies and be like, oh, the monster was cool. I like the part where he trashed the cafeteria. I don't feel like it would have had that sort of impact on me.
Well, kids have a lot of kids have empathy. I would have cried as a child when I watched this, because I remember crying at, like, Cinderella and, whatever, The Lion King, the original one that came out, and I think I was like almost a teenager when that one came out. So, and I hadn't experienced any grief yet, but, kids have empathy. That's a thing. Maybe not for David.
Yeah. I think maybe the empathy isn't so much the issue. And again, I can only speak out of the one small 10-year-old I own and operate, but maybe some of his friends too. But I think the problem is it gets too much into the interior and the psychological, and especially for a younger kid, and especially, 10-year-old boy, like, you're down for the monster fights and maybe even for some of the school drama, but all the talking, I was telling my son about the movies. I'm like, do you want to watch them with me? And he's like, do they talk about their issues? And I'm like, well, they kind of avoid them. But he's like, is there a lot of talking? And I'm like, well, but he was out by the time I could come up with an answer. So I think it might be too deep. And maybe Seth is right that this is maybe more for older kids, like tweens and teenagers.
Well, Seth, you said that you like to cry at movies, but you hadn't watched either of these movies, right? Why did you not watch these movies?
I hadn't heard of them. I did not know they existed until you asked me to do this panel. And I love Colossal, so, but I think that was probably covered and marketed more in my direction.
But so if you had seen the trailer for Monster Calls, you would have watched it?
I don't think so.
Okay, well.
I don't think enough would have come through. I think I would have assumed it was a movie kind of like Inkheart or Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, where, I don't know. I don't think I would have expected that much emotional processing, emotional gristle there to chew on.
Yeah, well, like the trailer for I Kill Giants doesn't give you any idea that it's a sad movie, from what I remember. And nevertheless, they weren't able to trick people into seeing it. But I feel like we may have like a just a surplus of kind of YA fantasy kind of movies, and I feel like a lot of people probably would have watched the trailers for these movies and been like, yeah, I already saw Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children or whatever. I'm good. Yeah. I don't know if everyone does. Anyone disagree with that?
No. I think that sounds just right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Seth, so you said that you loved Colossal, right? So let's talk about Colossal. Okay. So in Colossal, it's Anne Hathaway, and she's in her 20s, I think, and is living in New York City with her boyfriend, and hasn't been really looking very hard for a job, we gather, and has just been kind of drinking and partying all the time. And her boyfriend's fed up with her and kicks her out, and she goes back to her childhood home, which is empty, and runs into a childhood friend of hers, this guy, Oscar, who has inherited his dad's bar, and he hires her to work at the bar. And she sort of, falls into the same pattern of staying out all night drinking, and it's just sort of wandering home in the early hours of the morning across this playground near her house. And then it turns out that there's this giant monster that keeps appearing in Seoul, South Korea, and she starts to realize that this monster mimics her movements as she's walking across this playground drunk early in the morning. So Seth, why do you like this movie so much?
I think it's really well shot and well acted and gorgeous, but my favorite part by far is how it is almost exactly half a romantic comedy about a poignant romantic comedy, not a laugh-a-minute one, but about not making it in the big city and going back to your hometown and discovering that the things you left behind and turned your back on really have value and can regenerate your soul, and that there are people there who you never knew you were looking for your whole life. And then it keeps going. It does everything a romantic comedy does, but in a way that reveals how creepy a lot of these rom-com traits are. Like men who'll suddenly do anything for you and want to be a part of your life and bring you televisions and stuff. And the way in a rom-com, there's always this kind of breakdown of the relationship before the final get-together. And they have to come back from that and forgive each other. Colossal does an amazing job of taking every single one of these rom-com trajectories and just steering them right into horror, which I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, it was a total subversion of the whole romantic comedy trope, which I wasn't expecting. Halfway through, I thought I was going to hate this movie because I thought that's where it was going, and then it completely surprised me, and I was very happy. But it's a total subversion of the tropes. It's great.
I think just by the end, when there are these sequences where, like, they start with a rom-com setup, he's come to your house to apologize, and they show how frightening it is to have this man corner you in your living room and refuse to leave until he gets the answer he wants. It's not just subversive in a funny way. It's really frightening.
Well, it's a movie that very much plugs into the Me Too moment, right? I mean, I feel like of the three movies, it's the one that has the most obvious hooks into the social moment. I really liked it, too. And I think for exactly the reasons that you were talking about, I'm teaching both science fiction and gender studies this semester, and I have every intention of doing Colossal in both classes. I think it'll be seamless.
Yeah, I think this movie's brilliant. And Seth, you recommended this to me a couple years ago. And so I watched it. I was like, I think it's great. And the director he did a movie called Time Crimes, which is also really good, much more low budget than this. But he has a very distinctive voice in this movie, and it's just unlike anything else I can think of. And again, it didn't do well. I rewatched the trailer for it, and the first comment says, "This looks really good and original, so I'm sure it will bomb." So I don't know. Does anyone want to speculate on why this movie didn't do well, even though I think it's great?
I never saw it advertised. Like I do not remember seeing anything for this film. And I also think that for some reason I don't think that marketing departments are good at looking at a movie and say, okay, who would love this movie? And instead they often try to sell it as a different movie. I don't know why they do that, because it never seems to be a good idea. The whole bait and switch thing. But, I would show this movie to people that struggle with the, when you explain as a feminist, for instance, why the nice guy is often the worst guy. Like why are nice guys, why do nice guys finish last, that kind of thing. And when you explain to them, well, actually nice guys can often be the worst. What do you mean by that? Okay, let's sit down and watch this movie.
Yeah.
So this is exactly what that is about. And, incredibly successful. But, even if I did see it advertised, I don't remember it. So there was nothing memorable about the trailer or whatever that would cause me to remember it. And having watched it, I'm like, this is great. I could talk about this movie, for hours.
Well, yeah. You should go watch the trailer, because it's 100% deceptive. And it's just like,
of course,
she's got a drinking problem. Now she's controlling a monster. What a screwball turn of events. Her friends think it's hilarious. And that's like the whole trailer. Like it gives no hint that the movie is dark or, has any sort of point to it or anything.
Or that the F word is associated with it. I think Sarah hit the nail on the head. It's a feminist science fiction film. How many of those have been successfully marketed to mainstream audiences? And there's a nice, good, robust tradition of them out there, beginning with Metropolis, right?
Beginning with Mary Shelley.
Yes, right. Well, with stories, right? I was talking about films, but yeah, absolutely. All of these nod back to Mary Shelley, right? Because they're all about sympathetic monsters.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But I mean, do you think that if it were marketed truthfully, that it would be successful? Like, do you think a lot of people want to go see a creepy nice guy giant monster movie?
I think I totally would have seen it in the theater if it had been marketed this way. And, if there's any YouTubers that are listening out there that want to have an idea for a channel, just honest, like the whole honest trailer thing, one of the reasons why that's interesting, right, is because of what we've been talking about. But if somebody, honest trailers always goes a little too far in the point of making fun. But if somebody actually made honest trailers and tried to make them sincerely reflect what is good about these films that have been, unfairly maligned by the marketing departments of the world, then yeah, the right people would find those movies.
Yeah, I mean, because I totally agree with you that I thought this was a romantic comedy, and and there's basically like three guys who you're set up to think are like she's maybe going to choose between, right? So there's Tim, her boyfriend who kicks her out. There's Oscar, who seems the most obvious one, and then there's this guy Joel, who's sort of this handsome guy that she hooks up with. And each of them turn out by the end to be just completely unacceptable. Joel is probably is basically decent, but is pretty dim-witted and is just completely unwilling to stand up to his, awful friend Oscar. And so,
how many Joels do we know? We know so many Joels. Oh my gosh.
Well, he's a bro, right?
Yeah, he's totally bro.
I guess I'll also note, I think it's kind of interesting that all of these movies were directed by not American directors.
Yeah.
A Monster Calls and I Kill Giants. Oh, wait, no, sorry. A Monster Calls and Colossal were both Spanish directors, and then I Kill Giants is a Danish director. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Do you think that is that just a coincidence, or do you think that these sort of artistic giant monster movies appeal to more of a kind of magical realism sensibility, or Lisa?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I definitely think that they do. And there's, this is something that I will be talking about with my students on Wednesday, in fact, is right. There's a real difference between American and European speculative traditions, and that, since Mary Shelley and her parents, speculative fiction's been associated with the philosophical and with more with high art and high philosophy. And so I think it's no surprise that these metaphorical stories are coming from directors who are coming out of a tradition where you use this kind of lexicon, this language, this grammar to explore issues of life and death and hope and faith and all of the things that these movies do explore.
I guess we'll also just note there's kind of an interesting story behind A Monster Calls, because there was a woman or a writer, Siobhan Dowd, and she was diagnosed with cancer, and she came up with the idea basically for the book. This is based on a novel, and pitched it to her publisher and got a contract for it. And then she died before she had completed it. And so then Patrick Ness, I think, was sort of, contacted by the publisher to finish it. He may have known her. I'm not actually sure about that, but so he finished it. God,
that makes it even sadder.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave.
But going back to my point about, that at least I really got the sense that the people who made these movies felt that they were important and wanted them out there in the world.
For sure.
And that it's sort of maybe sad that they haven't, that they didn't find a wider audience. And then I Kill Giants is based on a pretty well received graphic novel, and the screenplay was written by the writer of the graphic novel. And again, he said he got the idea because I think he said he has a daughter, and just thinking about, what would it be like to not be there for his daughter. Mm-hmm. So, and I Kill Giants, I mean, I think it cost about, I think I have it here, but it had a budget of about 15 million and took in about 300,000. So,
Jesus.
Wow.
So I don't know if we'll see any more metaphorical giant monster movies.
I think it'll be hard to get the funding, right? I mean, there's already that 2-tier system in Hollywood, right? There's the blockbuster that you put, I don't know how much into, and you've got to make that money back the first weekend. And then there are the smart science fiction films, right? Like Her and Interstellar, where you're still putting in millions and millions of dollars, but you have a longer amount of time to make that money back, like a month, and you can include foreign sales. But this is like a whole 3rd tier, right? And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It feels like in some ways these movies die because they don't get any press or PR, but then they don't get, none of us see it. And it's just a real vicious cycle.
Yeah, until they show up on the iTunes charts 3 years later and I come across them. And,
right.
Yeah.
One thing I really like about Colossal is that it has some interesting intertextuality with Pacific Rim. They kind of talk to each other in I'm sure, an unintentional way. But one of the things I really don't like about Pacific Rim, for all that it's a well shot, gorgeous movie with a lot to say with its art design, is it has very, very weird politics. Guillermo del Toro his whole career has been about sympathy for the monster and taking the monster's side. And Pacific Rim is this movie where, people get in these big robots and fight the monsters, all of which are female. It's a plot point in the movie. Many of which have names like Slattern, or I think that's the name of the ultimate monster they fight at the end, with these kind of very feminine epithets. And I just always
do you want to just say
what
does that mean, Seth, for people who might not know?
I think it just means like a whore or like a filthy woman. I can't remember all the monster code names from Pacific Rim, but a lot of them are very gendered. And one thing I like about Colossal is that Anne Hathaway turns into the giant monster, the kaiju, and her weird, abusive would-be boyfriend turns into the giant robot. So it's almost like this reversal of the symbolic roles in Pacific Rim that I thought was cool.
So that's the problem with seeing movies at the drive-in. I totally missed that about Pacific Rim. And thank you for now ruining that movie. But that's a great point. But it's really cool because I felt too that Colossal was somehow in dialogue with Pacific Rim. And that's really helpful to think about it that way.
I mean, a critique I would definitely level against Colossal is it is a very white movie. Well, it doesn't
they
have a
all
lot
are.
Yeah, yes, that's really true.
They're really white.
We got at least Zoe Saldana, but my headcanon for Colossal is at the ending. So whenever she goes into this certain park in Colossal, the exact opposite point on planet Earth is the middle of Seoul, and that's where the monster appears. And I don't want to spoil the great ending twist, but she does end up in Seoul, and it was really good that the movie ends with her talking to a bartender there and talking to this other woman, because at least you get some acknowledgement that, like, this other place matters too, and maybe this is where she's going to start her new life. It's not just a backdrop.
I think we are going to spoil the end, because I guess the one thing that sort of threw me watching Colossal is that it wasn't, I mean, it sort of makes sense to me that if she goes to Seoul, that then the monster appears in New England, wherever she was. But it seems like weird to me that she would have necessarily thought that that was going to happen, or like figured that out. Like it seems like kind of a stretch to me. And when that happened, when I watched the movie the first time, I was kind of like, huh, wait, what? That happened? So I don't know if anyone else had that same reaction or not.
Well, I feel like all of these films, there's this sense that you just totally accept that this is the reality that we've stepped into. So I don't feel like because these are sort of psychological science fiction stories that are sort of borrowing these unreal elements, I don't sit there thinking, well, how are they explaining that? How are they explaining? I mean, these kids stumbled onto a playground, and were sort of hit by lightning. And then it means that all of a sudden this playground has magical properties, and that what they do in this playground affects a monster and a robot on the other side of the globe. I mean, it
sounds kind of absurd
nuts.
when you put it that way.
Yeah. So I feel like it's totally successful in the fact that, in the sense that if you start out with a crazy enough theory, you almost don't nearly need to explain it, especially if the other plot points are carrying the weight of the movie. If it's trying to pretend to be sciencey, that's a problem. And I so much prefer when things go unexplained than when things are badly explained.
Yeah, I just feel like maybe it could have used maybe just like one bit of foreshadowing or something. But I don't know.
But then it would have become Star Trek, right? Because someone would have had this realization. Because it feels like some ways like it's a Star Trek insight. Wait, if things are working this way, we could flip it around, right? And I feel like it would lose some of the dreaminess of the movie if someone had that realization. And I usually am down with the explanations or the foreshadowing, but I don't know. I didn't need it this time for some reason. It worked in the kind of dreamy logic of the story to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is a very kind of magical logic where if you want to, reverse your position with respect to someone, reverse your power, of course you have to reverse your physical place on the earth too.
Yeah. I guess I'll just say, I mean, I don't think we've talked explicitly about what is the metaphor here in Colossal. I mean, it seemed to me that the metaphor was that that Anne Hathaway has been, sort of having alcohol-related problems, and that this has been destructive, but she has sort of been oblivious to the harm that she's causing, in sort of the same way that she's oblivious to the harm that she's causing by having this monster destroy a city halfway around the world, not realizing that it's mirroring her actions.
I think that the metaphor was just, her confronting sort of this lifelong abuser, that right. This kid, when, you realize when she, through the flashbacks or whatever, that this kid has been mean to her since they were children, and she didn't really grasp that when they were kids. And, that this guy actually had some negative effect on her that, carried through her adulthood, and kind of possibly contributed to some poor life choices. And so in part, I think her choosing between the different men and so on, and especially rejecting him, even though it was never like about him trying to get with her explicitly or anything like that, it was like her rejecting his way of thinking and his way of being.
I agree with you, but I think it is about toxic masculinity, right? I mean, he's so angry at her for being better than him. Yeah. Like, that's what triggers everything, right? That's the root of the drinking. The root of their relationship is his fury that she's better than him.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't know, it feels like that's pretty easy to start extrapolating out to a larger culture that is very much in a moment where we're thinking about men and women's relations to one another and these sort of powered relationships.
But I think that's what the movie becomes about. But I didn't have the sense that her drinking problem was because he had mistreated her because I thought she'd only known him in elementary school. Like,
Well, childhood trauma is pretty intense.
Yeah.
I mean, you remember this stuff forever. I mean, there's a reason why you don't forget this stuff that happens to you. You have these sad stories that you tell your partner. Oh, this is what happened to me when I was a kid, and like that. Everybody has those collection of stories. But
I mean, she doesn't even remember. Like it comes back to her, right? This incident where he stomped on her.
Well, all of us do. But we all do things without understanding what our real intents are. I thought 100 years of Freud and other psychologists have taught us that, right? I mean, I thought that was all just a reaction, like the way we bury the trauma that's done to us.
Yeah.
Especially when it's by someone who supposedly is a good man who loves you.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, Seth, what do you think about this?
I think it's... Knowing people, it might be too easy to attribute all of Anne Hathaway as Gloria's problems to this one event. Because, I do think there is something really powerful about how each of them react differently to, their ability to control a giant creature in soul. Like, she eventually realizes that she is going to do harm through her carelessness and that she needs to stop. And she does this by, firmly not only drawing boundaries around herself and taking responsibility for her own actions, but also heroically, pushing this guy out of her life. It's not just brave of her to tell him no and call me a cynic, but I think a necessary step to getting away from such an abusive person might include moving to the opposite side of the world. I think that's another reason her going to Seoul is part of the solution to beating him. Just understanding that there is no way to coexist with him. There's no way to give him any ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if all her alcoholism and everything comes from him as a child, but I'm sure there's a pattern of her.
For the purposes of the movie, it's hard not to put those dots together, right? I mean, those are the pieces I'm given. So.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean we have to necessarily take it literally and say, well, X led to Y. It's just
100%.
That,
right.
Those things are there for a reason. Like we were given those flashbacks for a reason. And these two are intimately connected for reasons. Yeah. So narratively, it makes perfect sense.
Well, that's an interesting point, Seth, that this is maybe part of a pattern of behavior. And what do you think about Tim, her boyfriend, versus Oscar? Are they the same sort of toxic personality type, or are they distinct, do you think?
You should ask somebody else, just because I haven't seen this movie for a couple of years. So I don't remember Tim well enough.
Sarah, I mean, I'll just Tim is very sort of snide and condescending.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of the opposite of the other guy, right? He's not an alcoholic. He's very together. He has his life sorted. But he's not being empathetic with her. He's not helping her through this. He's just kind of, showing her what he probably imagines is tough love and booting her out, which is great if it was, and we don't see enough of her history. We do get the sense that they've argued about it before and that he tried. And in many ways, Tim is a somewhat sympathetic character. You kind of are like, well, yeah, I would probably kick her out too. But maybe if it's somebody who you love, you sit them down and you say, okay, you know what? You and I are going to work through this. We're going to see a counselor. We're going to, talk about this. We're going to get it sorted. And for him to just cut her off and kick her out when you don't get the sense that they've really done enough to lead up to that point. But I think that, that he exists to kind of say that there are different ways for men to not be supportive and not be thoughtful and not be what you need in your life to get through these things. And certainly, part of that is obviously that, and I love this, the sort of reversal of the trope that any man in those situations would be the thing that saves her. She's the one that has to figure out her way out of all of this.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, do you see, Lisa, Tim falling into the same pattern as Oscar, or do you see them as different?
I agree with Sarah. I think that Tim and Oscar and Joel and Garth, all four of them, they're different variations of men who are very different from each other and have very different motives, but are ultimately bound together by not being particularly supportive of at least this particular woman, right?
Yeah.
And that there are very much like, now that Frankenstein has come up, I can't help but think about, they're all very Victor Frankenstein. They're all very involved with themselves, right?
Yeah.
And there's no room for anything else. And that, guess what? Turns the woman into a monster. But then, yeah, but she figures it out herself. And I love that. I love when she writes, "I'm sorry" in the sand, that as a monster, she at first has no voice, but then she gains this voice through writing. And then she does start to draw boundaries, like Seth was saying, and to change the story.
I just went back, Lisa, and I listened to the interview you did on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy earlier, and you said that when they interviewed you for that James Cameron story of science fiction, that you had talked about something about monstrous femininity or something.
Yeah, we talked about monsters, and right.
Does any of that inform Colossal?
Oh yeah, for sure, right? And we have this tradition of monstrous women going all the way back to Metropolis, and the evil Maria is not large, although she feels larger than life at some points. And certainly, right, this is a movie that starts out, right, making that connection between this woman with this sort of monstrous life and the monster, right? So yeah, we have monstrous femininity, but then the question is, what makes monstrous femininity? And it seems to be toxic masculinity. This could take us back to Attack of the 50-Foot Woman as well, if we wanted to, right? There's this history of stories about women who are larger than life. Isn't there a song called Girls Like Giants, in fact? Like, that's really popular right now. It's like a YouTube song.
Well,
so,
I guess, how did you feel about, at the end, she basically kills Oscar?
Yeah.
Did you feel that was like 100% happy ending, or
no, it's a monstrous moment, right? She's a woman who's been pushed to monstrous behavior. But at the same time,
I totally disagree.
Well, okay, cool. I was going to just say, though, at the same time, we don't allow women to act out in those ways. And so I'm not sure if it is monstrous or necessary at the end. But go ahead. Why do you disagree? I want to hear.
I just think from like any ethical perspective, he's got the ability to do lethal harm. He's shown he's willing to use it. He has probably already killed people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's
definitely,
it's basically an armed standoff situation. I think
for sure
she had every right to kill him. I hope a court would not convict.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, right? But do you meet power with power? I mean, like, this is a big problem in feminism, right? The master's tools don't dismantle the master's house. And I don't know if you meet violence with violence. I agree with you. Like, personally, I'm happy she throws him across, time and space. But I don't know.
I will say that there is something symbolic about the fact that she throws him away. It's like the ultimate boundary setting. It's not like she crushes him or eats him.
Yeah, that's true. That's
she
true.
just
I thought the manner in which
as...
she gets rid of him was really good, because you're waiting in that moment, right? And they do sort of, they pause on that moment, because you know that she's got to do something. And there's a moment where she's like, oh my God, is she going to eat him? Is she going to, like, what's she going to do?
Yeah.
And the fact that she just flings him away from her is, I think, really powerful. And they would never tie it to her anyway. I mean, like, they don't show the guy's body, but you presume that the guy ended up, getting impaled by a telephone pole or something in the middle of New England. And so, it's like one of those freak accidents. Like, how did this happen? But yeah, I think it was great metaphorically that if she did resort to violence, that it wasn't a particularly masculine way of putting him down.
Well, and it's great, right? Because that's what you're supposed to do with a bad man, is throw him out of the house.
Well, I can definitely buy Seth's argument that, that he's a mass murderer and this is the only means at her disposal to prevent him from killing again. I can totally buy that. But even granting that, it seems like there's two possible interpretations, that this is either supposed to be read as just a moment of total empowerment for her and a happy ending, or that this is sort of like she had to give up something of her own goodness. And it had to be done, but we still can feel the loss of, that she had to become this monster in order to address the situation.
I think it was both. In the end, when she realized what probably happened to him, she started crying. But she also, I think, understood that she kind of had to do what she did.
Yeah. Have any of you, this movie came out, 2 years ago? Right?
Maybe more.
2, 3? Yeah.
3 maybe.
Okay, but in another weird moment of convergence, just as we're talking about it, I'm thinking about, there was a novel that came out a couple of years ago by Naomi Alderman called The Power. And it's all about like women suddenly evolve in a way that allows us to have more physical strength than men. And what happens is just violence from the past is met with more violence. And I feel like this movie sort of is exploring that same set of issues, right? What happens when women who are abused suddenly gain immense power? Like, how will they act, right? Will they act different than the people around them or not? And I think this movie really doesn't give you an easy answer to it.
Yeah, I wish I had read that book, but I haven't, so I can't really comment on it. But
everyone should read it. It's a weird book. Disturbing. It's disturbing. And I think Colossal's disturbing. And it's not a bad thing to be disturbed, right? We should talk about tough choices.
Yeah. I guess one other thing I wanted to bring up about Colossal is I just noticed, so there's a well-known film critic, Rex Reed, and he gave the movie 0 out of 4 stars and said it was incomprehensible. I thought it was pretty straightforward, but does anyone understand why someone would just be completely baffled by this movie?
I can understand why a man would be completely baffled by this movie.
Yes. I agree. I think that it is incomprehensible to some men. It's also maybe incomprehensible to people who don't do science fiction and fantasy. You know, I think that in the speculative genres, we deal with metaphor a little bit differently than in mainstream literature.
Yeah.
And we're more comfortable with the metaphorical also sometimes being the literal. Like if someone says her world exploded, we know that maybe it literally exploded.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think sometimes non-science fiction people, I find this when I teach, like they come to these texts and they just don't know what to do with, like, is the giant real? Is it a metaphor? Is it something in between? And it's distressing for some people to not have those reading protocols in place.
Yeah. It's like when Anthony Lane reviews Star Trek. I find it hilarious. Whenever a new Star Trek film comes out to read, I basically hate read Anthony Lane whenever a new Star Trek film comes out, because he's so unequipped to review Star Trek as Star Trek and so unwilling to review Star Trek as Star Trek. And so he's just like treating it like it's 50 Shades of Grey. And it's hilarious to watch him grapple with something that is so out of his wheelhouse.
Seth, what do you think?
I think maybe it has something to do with how it starts being one kind of movie and becomes another. I think maybe if you were really full of expectation about where it was going to go, you would feel lost when it sort of swerved off the map that you were expecting.
Does it, though? Or is it just the trailer that makes you think it does?
No, I mean, I hadn't seen the trailer, and it totally threw me for a loop. I mean, the direction that the story went. I mean...
I think if you're not ready for that shift to the fantastic and you're not a speculative genre person, I think that would be really hard to follow that.
I'm looking at my notes here. There's one other thing I definitely wanted to bring up. So in A Monster Calls, there's this bully, Harry, I think. And it definitely seemed pretty gay. Does everyone agree that we were meant to read that as a gay subplot or in a gay context?
It seemed like there was some homophobia driving that relationship. Yeah. That was the
But you don't think that we're meant to read Harry himself as closeted, or?
I think you could.
Well, even if we're not supposed to directly interpret that as homosexuality, I think they were definitely saying that Harry had some issues of his own that he was unable to sort out, and that his way of dealing with that was through violence. You know, you get these glimpses where they showed us that he was hurting too, and you don't know by what, and they kind of kept, that curtain drawn. But I definitely think that he had some issues in there, and whether that was explicitly supposed to be homosexuality or not, I don't know. But you definitely got the sense that, I was almost expecting in that movie for something to happen between them where, they had a talk and, they bonded over something. And that's not what ended up happening. But definitely there was undercurrents there they were trying to explore.
I agree. I thought something was going to happen with the two of them because Harry kept giving Connor these looks, and I couldn't figure out the looks. But you know what? If it has to do with some sort of a repressed gay subplot, that actually helps make sense of like the strange economy of the gays that was going around completely. Just the way that Harry kept giving him these looks.
Yeah. Well, and there's a line where he says something like, O'Malley and I have an understanding that I'm the only one who gets to touch him or something like that. And then in the first scene where he's bullying him, he's basically like, I bully you because you have such an awesome imagination, which seems like strange to me, but that it's sort of like weirdly complimentary almost.
Well, it's as though he's jealous of him. It felt like in some way that, Harry was jealous of Connor on some level, and you're not sure why.
I mean, maybe it's the imagination, but I think kids getting bullied for having imagination doesn't strike me as particularly surprising at all.
Yeah.
I thought that seemed
No, but it was the fact that he would say it, that he would put it like that struck me as noteworthy. No, Seth?
Maybe it's really like a lot of depth for a kid to have to recognize that about himself. I don't know.
Yeah, I just think there was a lot going on in that relationship, and I haven't really come to any firm conclusions about it, but it's rich for interpretation.
It did. I mean, I think, like Sarah said, I was expecting there to be at least one more scene between them where some sort of understanding would come out of it. And it struck me as a little odd that, Connor sort of punches him a bunch of times and sends him to the hospital, and we never see that character again. I don't know if they felt like, I can only speculate, but I wonder if maybe there was more to that relationship in the novel. I haven't read the novel, but if there was more to that in the novel or more to that in the original screenplay, and they just felt like, for whatever reason, they didn't want to put it in the movie.
In all of these films, the way of dealing with bullies was explicitly by visiting the same pain upon them, right? By being violent with them. Right. In return for what they were doing to you, and that was the only thing that bullies respect. In one of them, they explicitly said that. Yeah. I think it was in I Killed Giants. Barbara was explaining it to Sophia. And by the way, Sophia was a wonderful character. I loved Sophia. I feel like, that's one of the things that we have heard constantly for movies like this about bullies. And I don't know whether or not it's true, but it certainly feels, victorious for the audience.
Wow. It's really interesting as you put it this way, right? Because all of these movies are ultimately about bullying. And in a moment of great incivility, especially, on social media and on any media and online, it's interesting that each of these movies really sort of meditates on the danger of giving back what you get. Yeah. And the need to change that script. Well, that's a hopeful way to think about them then, right? That we can meet these gigantic, seemingly intractable forces of harm and hurt and maybe do something different.
Well, that's sort of,
or not, depending.
Well,
right?
what's sort of, there's this famous Nietzsche line where he says, those who fight monsters should take care that in the process they don't become monsters.
Right.
And it strikes me that in movies that are so much about, monsters as metaphor and how you can become a monster if you're not careful and stuff, that more analysis isn't given to the ethics or the wisdom of physically beating the shit out of your bully. It seems like that deserves more, more scrutiny, that idea.
Well, we might not have solved that problem. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, it's one of the great questions that is dealt with, the Star Trek Discovery season 1 dealt with, if your bully is intent on hurting you and for no reason doesn't seem to be any way to fix it, do you just visit upon them what they're doing to you as a show of strength? And is that at all ethical? And I think the point is to grapple with the question, but it would be better if we had better answers than, just giving them, an eye for an eye.
Well, and isn't that, maybe that's part of why these movies bombed, is because they do grapple with these questions. And I don't think they come to clear answers, right? They sort of leave it to you in good science fictional fashion to continue to have those discussions afterward amongst yourself instead. And a lot of people don't go to movies to have hard conversations afterwards.
All right, so we are pretty much out of time. So I think we're going to need to wrap this up. So let's get some final thoughts on these three. How do you feel about having watched and discussed these three movies, I Killed Giants, Monster Calls, and Colossal? So Lisa, final thought.
So I appreciate that we talked about them all. And again, I'm really interested that there's this subgenre that seems to be out and about in the world right now that is maybe about bullying, maybe about dealing with emotions that are larger than life, but often neglected. But when it comes down to it, personally, I still like them better in the science fictional mode. So something like Colossal, as opposed to the more fantastic mode of I Killed Giants and a Monster Calls. But it's there. And I'd be curious to see more of them. I wonder if someone could make a movie that we would all really like in this mode.
Seth, final thought.
I mean, I love Colossal. I think it's one of my favorite movies. I don't think it's particularly more science fictional than the other two, just aimed at an older audience. And I liked both A Monster Calls and I Killed Giants. I found both of them a little, neat. They had their themes and they set them up and they delivered on them, and I found them a little frustratingly tidy. But I think that's probably something the kind of person who prefers Colossal would say. And I think they make a great double feature. They're basically the same movie, but executed in very different ways. And I enjoyed watching both of them. I'm glad we did this panel so that I could see them.
Yeah, but they're sort of structurally predictable in a way that Colossal isn't.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Sarah, final thought.
I think they're all worth watching. I think that I Killed Giants and a Monster Calls should be, sort of required watching for families who are going through, somebody getting cancer, to, sit down with your kid and watch these and talk about them. I think that Colossal somebody should make an honest trailer for the fact that it's feminist science fiction, and it's great. It's really, there's a lot to pick apart in that film, and it's very, very underrated and under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone definitely watch Colossal, and definitely watch I Kill Giants and Monster Calls if you feel like crying while watching Giants. All right, and so we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Sara Lynn Michener, Seth Dickinson, and Lisa Yaszek. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's always fun.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Sara Lynn Michener, Seth Dickinson, and Lisa Yaszek for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to John Jers, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.